And today is November the 17th, 2024, and we are here to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it in another episode of Will Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello.
Good evening. How goes it,
Hello.
Sip? Yo.
Oh, hey.
How you doing?
Doing all right. How have you been?
Pretty solid. Had a big Dota downswing, but hanging in there.
That's how it goes with MOBAs.
Yep. Bunch of rascals. But you try to learn a little bit every game, even if you lose.
Yeah.
There's been a bunch of buzz this week. People talking about Trump's cabinet and that kind of thing. My new BG3 run is going. That's cool. I'm fighting the goblin leaders and stuff now. I'm playing a ranger as my Tav this time. But I still have a open hand monk. I'll try not to piss off any Githyanki prodigies this time.
That's probably the move.
Mm.
So what's it like playing a ranger?
Ranger's a very high damage class. It's like just slightly dipping into spellcasting, but they don't have very many spells they get. Hunter's Mark you start out with, and that's really, really good. Just because everything takes 1 to 6 more damage from all attacks. So if you have a dual-wielding character with a main hand and an offhand, you're getting 1 to 6 more damage with every single hit, and also from every other party member who's hitting that target. So it's a really nice kind of focus down targets sort of plan. I'm going with a Hunter Ranger, so they're relatively better at killing stuff. They don't have the summons like a Beastmaster.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not very stealthy. But I'm also proficient in heavy armor. So it's kind of like you're a tank archer, almost.
It's pretty interesting. Are you going to go for the... I guess it's a perk or something that lets you do more damage if you're using the bow at point-blank range?
Yeah, I might do that. There's also the Sharpshooter, which gives you lower chance to hit, but you get more damage. And if you have Risky Ring, which is one of the best in the game, you just give your archer that to offset it. And then they still have a really high chance to hit.
It's pretty nice.
Mm-hmm. Yep, it's a good run. I have a Drow character again. Looks kind of the same. Habits die hard.
It's all right.
I'm bringing Asterion this time, too, because I wanted to see what his personality is like. I've always outed him from the camp when he tries to drink my blood, but apparently his dialogue is really funny, and a lot of people really love the character, so I'll give him a chance.
Yeah, well, that'll be fun. Get to finally get a look at him.
Yeah. What you been gaming this week?
I started picking up Elite Dangerous again.
I haven't played that one.
It's pretty fun if you're willing to tolerate its bullshit. It almost feels sometimes like the game resents you playing it. You know, everything kind of feels a little more difficult than it needs to be.
What do you do? What's the objective?
There is none. You just do whatever you want. It's kind of a big sandbox game. And, you know, there's a lot of games like that, but I don't know. Elite Dangerous just kind of makes it difficult to figure out some of the underlying game mechanics. So it can be hard to figure out what you should be doing or what you need to do or how things work. It's kind of an uphill battle. And it is a live service game, so they do kind of purposely make it a little grindy so they can increase the likelihood that you log back in repeatedly, because that's kind of how they make their money. So, you know, those are some things not to like about it, but the aesthetic is really good. It's a space sim, so that aspect of it is pretty strong. And they do give you a lot of different things to do as far as gameplay. So, you know, not for everybody, but if you're in the mood for it, there's not really anything else that can scratch that itch quite like ED does.
Is it single player or multiplayer?
I It can be either. They've actually got a persistent universe, but you can actually play in it in solo mode where there's no other players there. Or you can do multiplayer mode where there are other players there. And they're not separate universes. You know, what happens in solo mode actually impacts the same universe that all the multiplayer guys are in. So it's not like they're completely segregated. You know, it's basically just solo is for people that don't want to put up with human bullshit, which last I checked is probably most people who play the game, actually. But for those of you social butterflies, they do have that multiplayer mode if you feel like getting ganked by somebody way more powerful than you.
A lot of people are into that.
Yeah, I don't doubt it. I just want to move stuff around in my space truck. That's my main thing. I don't need other people around to do that.
And after dealing with people in like salty games, playing a single player game can be really refreshing and nice.
Oh yeah.
It's a big part of why I like BG3 so much. You can work together with someone of your choice. I'm not queued with random BG3 people who are going to sabotage my run.
Yeah.
I can trust you to be more cautious than myself, and we have fun, and if I play by myself, it's also fun. In Dota, it's a 50-50, whether you get some jacked base gamers on your team or just hateful bastards.
Yeah, there are quite a few goblins out there, unfortunately. And MOBAs in particular. Yeah, that's kind of why I stopped playing Left 4 Dead 2 back in the day. Just kind of got tired of the randoms.
It makes sense. What's been going on in the world?
I mean, it's mostly just kind of been people reacting to the election result in the US. Beyond that, it's mostly just stuff that was just already ongoing. I haven't really seen a lot new going on, per se. I think everybody kind of wants to wait and see what the incoming Trump administration actually does, because there's a lot of talk about what they might do, but nobody really knows for sure yet. So people are very curious about that, but the shoe doesn't drop in that regard until January, or whenever Inauguration Day is. Yeah, so we're kind of in limbo right now. A very awkward, anxiety-ridden limbo. I would point out that Germany's government's collapse.
I heard about that.
That was not because of the American election. That had more to do with domestic political considerations. There's been tension between the coalition partners in the government there for a while. And the party in the coalition responsible for making the budget, I believe, is the Liberal Democrats. And they've apparently not been very cooperative with their coalition partners regarding the construction of the budget. You know, apparently they've kind of gone out of their way to release budgets that are mostly favorable to their agenda, but with very few items that are in congruence with the agendas of their coalition partners. And in the past, that's resulted in, you know, some fireworks and tension. You know, they basically have to go back to the drawing board and then do it again. But after they did it, you know, for however many times they've done it before now, after they did it again recently, the prime minister finally just pulled the plug. He's just tired of putting up with them.
What does it mean to pull the plug in this case?
He ended the coalition agreement. He basically said that he's not going to cooperate with them anymore. And what that means is that the governing coalition no longer has a majority, because now it's just the SPD and the Green Party. Without the Lib Dems, they don't have enough seats to have a majority, and they're going to have to call new elections. So that's what's on the horizon now for Germany. New elections that'll probably bring in a new government. It's not really clear yet who will win. But from what I was reading, there's a strong suspicion it'll be another SPD-CDU coalition. For those of you who don't know, you know, what all those letters mean, the SPD is the main center-left party in Germany, and the CDU is the main center-right party. They're the two largest parties. Like a lot of mainstream parties around the developed world, their base of support has been eroding over the past couple decades. Various populist left, populist right parties of various stripes have been kind of eating away at them. I think the AFD is probably the most famous of those. But they've managed to kind of keep out the most radical parties over the past couple of decades. And generally what has happened in the past is that if there's no clear-cut winner, then the SPD and the CDU will just enter into a kind of broad coalition with each other, kind of a Big Ten, even in spite of some of their big differences. That's actually the coalition that had governed Germany before the most recent coalition that had the SPD, the Greens, and the Lib Dems in it took over. What happened with that previous coalition is that basically SPD voters, and if you're from Germany and you have more details on this, let me know. Or if I'm getting it wrong, let me know especially. But from what I had read at the time, SPD voters were getting very tired of the coalition because they didn't think they were getting enough out of it. The coalition kind of leaned towards the right in terms of policymaking, and that resulted in a lack of progress on unions, union rights, better deals for workers, higher wages, that kind of stuff. And that kind of grated people, and it finally got to the point where the voters were saying that if the SPD didn't leave the coalition and try to actually just win power with some other collection of parties, then they wouldn't turn out to vote, or they'd vote for somebody else. And so the SPD leadership broke with the CDU when the next election came up, and they created this, I think it's called the Traffic Light Coalition, with the Greens and Lib Dems. They call it the Traffic Light because of the colors of the different parties. So that was an unstable and kind of unwieldy coalition, but it did give SPD voters sort of their desired outcome, which was relatively more emphasis on left-wing priorities in government. But it's kind of been a very messy coalition from the start. Broad, bigger coalitions with multiple parties in them tend to be pretty unwieldy. And they also had the misfortune of taking power like right around the time that the war in Ukraine started, which of course was very disruptive to Germany's economy. And so they've kind of borne the brunt of a lot of public dissatisfaction with economic malaise in Germany. The energy shock from the war in Ukraine, residual inflation from COVID, as well as just sort of the general ongoing malaise in the German economy that had preceded even all of that stuff. A lot of the weight of that has fallen on the SPD now, and they're really feeling the unpopularity. So this is kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. They were already under pressure, and then this latest kerfuffle was enough to lead the SPD to basically de facto call for new elections. And so we'll see who kind of wins out. That's all up in the air too. I did read today that the leader of the CDU, I think it's the leader of the CDU, was saying that if they were elected, they would consider easing or removing the debt brake in Germany, which is basically a rule that requires the German government to have a balanced budget. And politically speaking, in Germany, the debt brake is very popular. A lot of people there really don't like the idea of the government borrowing too much money. So they prefer something close to a balanced budget there. So it would be a significant change in policy if the German government kind of shifted away from that. Certainly if the CDU was the party that did it, since they're the more conservative party between the two major parties in Germany, and generally have been the more hawkish, fiscally speaking. I don't think it would be revolutionary. Some of the article that I read about it kind of suggested it would be a major change and that it could rejuvenate the German economy if the German government finally allowed deficit spending and actually spent some money on stimulus. But I think the record of stimulus spending over the past 20 years has been very, very mixed. So I really don't see that as a pathway to significant rejuvenation of the German economy. I think macroeconomists are probably the ones who are the most excited about it because their models kind of suggest that Germany is propagating imbalances in global trade, basically by having public policy that skews towards supply rather than consumption. And that this allows or pushes, depending on how you want to frame it, countries like the United States, which are more consumption oriented, to borrow more money than they normally would or probably should. And that creates basically unsustainable debt growth in the United States, and it creates an unhealthy dependency on foreign consumption on the part of German producers. But I think that's a very skewed way of looking at economics. Macroeconomic models have a lot to offer, but I think people who are reading into German policy like that are reading those models very narrowly. They should not be taken so literally. They're meant to be sort of just broad descriptions of how economies behave, but I don't think that they can offer that level of granular detail that we can say for sure that deficit spending is going to ease all of these imbalances in global trade. I don't even think characterizing them as global imbalances is really all that accurate. So I don't think that's gonna. If they do that, if they actually do start deficit spending, I would not predict any significant change in the trajectory of the German economy or the European economy in the medium term. In the short term, it'll probably goose production and there will be some bump, but just given precedent, given the data that we've seen over the past 20 years, I don't think it'll be that dramatic. And I think people will be pretty disappointed in it. Kind of like people are increasingly disappointed with China's government stimulus. They've been announcing more new stimulus over the past couple months. We haven't really covered it much, but they did announce that they're going to try to do that, which they'd kind of been, delaying. A lot of people have been saying that there really wasn't anything for China to do to stimulate its economy beyond just increased government spending to try to, direct transfers to consumers to try to boost consumption that way in order to ease the transition of China's economy from a export/investment oriented economy to a consumption driven economy. But that's not going to work. Shifting economies to consumption driven economies is not like a scientific thing. It's not like if you push just the right buttons in just the right order, then you can engineer a consumption driven economy. It basically just has to happen organically, and it's not something that public policy can really do more than kind of encourage. Anything beyond that is unlikely. So I always thought that the push for more fiscal expansion in China was kind of wrong-headed and wouldn't result in anything. And, it's still very early. I don't think most of the fiscal stimulus has even happened yet, but the early returns have not been particularly encouraging. And even the Chinese government has actually been watering down some of the plans that it had announced earlier. So, fiscal expansion right now is not really going to be like the main solution. It could be part of the solution, but if you're just throwing money at an economy that's in stagnation or in decline, you're not fixing anything. You're just wasting money. That's not going to work.
If China's trying to shift to a consumption-based economy, what do they have now?
They used to have more of an export-oriented economy, but actually, contrary to what the public seems to think about it, exports are now a pretty small part of China's economy. I think it's like 10 to 15%, something in that range. So it's not that big a deal anymore. The bigger thing, more in the past 15 years, let's say, has been investment, mostly by the government. And I think it kind of peaked around like 50 to 60% at one point, maybe 5 to 10 years ago. But that's a very high amount, especially given that it was largely driven by the public sector. I've seen people, online, again, for what little that's worth, I've seen people online arguing that actually it's good that the Chinese government is investing in their country and that it's better to be investing in new infrastructure and all that jazz. But the reality is that when it comes to infrastructure, China is well into the realm of diminishing returns. Like all of the low-hanging fruit as far as infrastructure that needed to be built and developed, that's been picked. They've already done that. Like China has most of the infrastructure that it needs now to succeed as a modern economy. They can build more, but it's not going to give nearly as much of a return as the infrastructure they were building 20 or maybe even 10 years ago. So now money that's being spent like that is not going to get a return on investment that would be acceptable, like in most places. At this point, it would be better to either just give the money back to consumers in the form of tax breaks, maybe in terms of transfers, or, and this is what economists generally argue, it would be smarter to invest in a social safety net. One of the reasons Chinese consumers do not consume is because they have to save, owing to the absence of things like Social Security, a strong public healthcare system, just general corruption and the whole apparatus of government. Like all of that stuff means that people cannot depend on the government to pay for that stuff for them. They largely have to pay for it themselves. And that means they have to save up a lot of money for emergencies, just for contingencies relating to health or whatever, education, et cetera. And that inherently puts a structural crimp on their propensity to spend as opposed to save. And any broader shift towards consumption is going to require that to change. And the government has been kind of loath to do that. I don't think the government is necessarily opposed to the idea of a bigger social safety net in general. I think the issue is that there's just so many goddamn people in China that the per capita fiscal burden of doing that on a substantial level would be too great for them. They're just not there yet. They could try it, but it would either have to have like a lot of rationing that favored people in given regions of the country, or maybe in given income brackets, or some other form of rationing that would leave a lot of people out of the loop, which would probably spark inequality, unrest, and other bad social phenomena that the Communist Party of China is very much trying to avoid, being a one-party state. So I suspect that's the main reason they haven't been doing that. But regardless of the reasons, they have not. And so that's a big reason why consumers have been holding back, and a big reason why economists have kind of been trying to pressure them to address that. But yeah, investment is very much what had been driving their economy, and largely disproportionately continues to.
Interesting. Yeah, corruption seems pretty spooky because you can invest in projects, but if a bunch of people pocket a whole bunch of the money, then it doesn't seem like such a good project.
Yeah, that's another problem. There's just so much corruption that if even if the party did want to do a lot of fiscal expansion, the trouble that they're going to face is that a good chunk of that money is just going to disappear. I suspect that may be another of the driving motivations there for the party's aversion to doing big fiscal expansion. They would prefer to have that money spent at the national level, where the upper level of the party can keep track of the money, or maybe just steal it themselves, depending on their priority. But that inherently means that their ability to implement public policy that reaches broad swaths of the population is limited, because the middleman between the upper level of the government and the regular people is sort of the mid-tier of government, right? The provincial governments, the local governments, etc. And that's generally where most of the corruption in the party is considered to reside. That's not entirely fair. Again, the upper strata of the party probably is just as bad, if not worse. But the narrative within China, even with the party itself, actually, is that there is corruption in China, but it's the lower levels of the party that are bad.
I think I remember you telling me that, where that's like the scarecrow or the punching bag that the party uses to be like, well, we're not like the local officials who are corrupt.
Yeah.
You can trust the national government at least.
Yeah, that's one of the ways they deflect criticism, and it's fairly effective. You see the shitheads in your local government all the time, but the guys in the upper strata of the party, they're kind of far away. They're more of an abstract concept than anything that you can kind of embody, in your mind. So it's easier for them to kind of pretend like they're off somewhere in the ether, trying to protect the country and whatnot. But the local official doesn't have that luxury. Like, you can very obviously see him stealing shit, around town. It's a lot harder to hide that. So rather than just trying to suppress any and all criticism like they used to do, they kind of try to do a little divide and conquer. They try to play the people off of the lower rungs of the party. And people have been willing to kind of play along with that. I don't know how many really believe it. People in China are generally very, very cynical about politics, both in China and elsewhere. So I don't know that many people actually take that seriously. But broadly speaking, people kind of appreciate that they have some scope to criticize government and play along with it for that reason.
Yeah, it makes sense. People do believe some pretty dumb shit sometimes, so.
Yeah. So that's what's up with China, and that's how it's similar with Germany right now. They've kind of had export and investment-driven economies for much of the past few decades, and that model is kind of hitting a wall, and they need to change it somehow. But it's not clear if they even can do that. I think I've argued on here before that a lot of the problems that the general public in the United States, as well as in other countries around the world, are most upset about, are the problems that governments are generally least able to actually substantively address. If you want the government to try to put out a forest fire, they can do that. If you want the government to try to change the trajectory of structural change in your country's economy, probably not going to happen. That's pretty much an immutable force. They can ease the pain a little bit, but that's about it. If you live in a developed country, it's just inherently more expensive to produce stuff there, so inherently manufacturing is going to be drawn elsewhere. You can try to force it back, but the stuff you produce is going to be more expensive. Yeah. And that's going to put it at a big disadvantage. At that point, you either need lots of protections, which is going to cost broader society more than it gains in terms of, jobs returning to the country, or alternatively, you can have the government give subsidies to make them competitive, which China has done in a lot of cases. But in that case, you're having to spend, shit tons of public resources that could be spent on other stuff. And by the way, when you spend subsidies like that, you're creating a constituency of voters who have an incentive to propagate those subsidies, regardless of whether or not they're actually adding to the broader public welfare. And that could be a very difficult problem to unwind if that voting base gets big enough. Lots of countries in the developing world have had problems with that, especially in the 70s in Latin America, where I think we've talked before about how they did import substitution strategies to develop their economies, only to basically end up kind of mired in stagnation, especially in the 70s and 80s. And part of that was just because political constituencies had been created amongst the infant industries that emerged because of the protectionist regimes that were erected that did not want any change to the system. They didn't want protections, that is, protectionist policies like tariffs to be eased so they could continue to benefit from a lack of competition, but at the same time, they wanted the subsidies to also continue so that they would not have to become more competitive. They could just rely on government money in order to continue to make profits without ever actually having to change the business model to become self-sufficient. Those are very difficult problems to address in pretty much any country. In so much as it's worked out in China, it's because China is very large and they have a big enough market that there's enough competition to kind of erode that. But even in China, it's a big problem. State-owned enterprises and even private enterprises enjoy the benefits of considerable corruption by way of their interpersonal ties with individual members of the party at all levels of government.
Bit of a systemic issue then.
Yeah.
It is a tall task governing that many people at once. Going to be hard
Very
to have
much so.
a perfect solution for it.
Probably the best you can do is decentralization. Then you can kind of diffuse the burden of governing people to lower levels of government so that each individual level of government has fewer people to be responsible for. That's basically how we make it work in the United States. Mm-hmm. But the issue there is that then you're kind of giving more power to specific regions, lower levels of government. And that can create centrifugal forces. Some of those lower levels of government, some of those regions may have independent streaks that resent being tied to the rest of the country, and they may eventually push for more autonomy or even outright independence. And that's much easier to do if you have a decentralized political system. So that's kind of the trade-off you face. And if you're a country like India or China, you don't really feel entirely comfortable, with devolving more power to lower levels of government, specifically for that reason. Both countries have had histories of centrifugal forces threatening the integrity of the state. So they've actually kind of leaned more into a pseudo-federal model. You can't run a country as big as China and India without having some degree of federalism. Like, it's just impractical otherwise. But at the same time, there's a spectrum of models of federalism that ranges from more centralized to decentralized. And China and India have definitely landed on the more centralized side of that spectrum.
Kind of like the federalist, anti-federalist discussion in the U.S.
Yeah, kind of similar, except a little more brute force.
Mm-hmm.
the elites in India and China were not really all that willing to take input from the broader public. They kind of made their choice and then imposed it. More so in China than in India, but even in India's case, there was a sense that elites needed to maintain relatively more discretion than a fully representative democratic society would really facilitate. So the result is that the central government in India has a lot more power than the central government here in the United States, despite them both technically being federal systems of government. Yeah, the federalist anti-federalist debate was a lot more academic in that regard, and it happened within the context of a very, very small country. Geographically big, but in terms of population, I think the US didn't have more than maybe 5 million people. I mean, assuming we're talking like 1800, the year 1800, it would have been around that amount, like around 5 million scattered around a huge-ass country. So that's a pretty different context than like a China or an India, where you've got 1 billion plus people all crammed together. Very different prospect. Yeah, we definitely leaned on the decentralized side of that spectrum. Extremely so in the early going. Yeah, the anti-federalists kind of got the better of that. I think it wasn't even until the Civil War that people started referring to the United States without the word, what was it? Is? No, after the Civil War, they started saying the United States is. And then before it, they kind of referred to it more in the plural form. The United States are, as in referring to all of the multiple states kind of acting together. And there was still a sense for a long time after independence that the United States of America was not really a country per se, but was really more just a federation of different independent states cooperating. And, different people were of different minds on that. Some people definitely did think of it as a single country, but nobody really wanted to trust too much power to the federal government. Everybody kind of preferred more power with their individual states. It really took the Civil War to kind of broadly change the public sentiment on that count. Well, Joe Biden did announce that Ukraine can lob missiles at targets within Russian territory using American munitions. That's pretty exciting. Yeah, specifically the ATACMS missiles, the Army's cruise missile of choice. Although I would add that they're only actually allowed to attack targets in Kursk. So specifically, they're going to be attacking targets that are relatively close to the front line there, where the Ukrainians pushed into Russia. So this is not like a blanket allowance where they'll be able to hit anything in Russia. The broader restrictions on usage still pretty much apply. There's just this one exception for this one particular region.
Why the change?
I think the Biden admin said that they were doing it as retaliation for the introduction of North Korean troops to the conflict.
Oh, I see.
Supposedly, the North Korean troops have started actually fighting in Kursk. So apparently Washington wanted to do something to try to retaliate there. A little tit for tat.
The North Korean troops have finally figured out how to manage their time with the advent of the internet.
Yeah, I guess they stopped gooning for long enough to actually do some fighting. So it would seem.
They're like, guys, it's time to stop. We have a war to fight. It's funny. Well, I saw Bitter Sugar tuning in chat. He said that their electricity was going to be limited again pretty soon, where it gives them like rolling outages where you know that you're going to not have power for a period of time. He said they were getting bombed for like 14 hours or something.
Yeah, there was another volley of Russian cruise missiles and drones and whatnot targeting the power grid. That happened a couple days ago. Happens semi-regularly, so I don't think anybody's that surprised by it. But it does have unfortunate repercussions. Let's see. Well, I guess the cabinet is what people have been kind of harping on, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let me see what I can find. I think RFK has gotten some attention, humorously so. He's going to be head of the Department of Health.
Yeah,
I think
it's controversial choice because he's anti-vax and has more of the alternative views on some of the conventional medical wisdoms.
I don't know. Do you think getting rid of the FDA is an alternative view?
Kind of, yeah. It's a pretty major move.
He wants to get rid of our chlorinated water, Neuro.
Like our swimming pools?
No, there is chlorine added. No, not chlorine.
Fluoride.
Fluoride.
Yeah.
There we go. One of those chemicals. Yeah, fluoride in the water. He wants to get rid of that. Had a lot of people making Dr. Strangelove references. Have you ever seen that?
Dentist. I think you mentioned it, but I don't remember if I've seen it. It's like a really old movie, right?
I want to say no, but actually, it is pretty old by now. I want to say mid-late 60s. So yeah, it's pretty decent age. Excellent Cold War satire for those few of you who may find that interesting. Dr. Strangelove is one of, if not the best. Yeah, fluoridation in the water supply is like an old conspiracy from back in the day, and there was definitely an element in the United States during the Cold War that thought it was a communist conspiracy to try to somehow poison the public and maybe hypnotize them into becoming communists or some damn thing. They were always on some wild-ass tangent. So now we have somebody who wants to get rid of it, going to be the head of the Department of Health. We'll see how that plays out. I don't know how much he'll actually tangibly be able to do, but at the same time, you have to kind of consider that the traditional constraints on an administration may not apply to the incoming administration. So they may actually be able to do quite a bit if they're willing to ignore certain rules and norms. I don't doubt there will be drama over that. Let's see, what else was there? Oh yeah, he announced his China team. Well, not his China team per se, but like there are offices in the government that are relatively more relevant to foreign policy in China. And he's announced some of the names there. So Secretary of State, he said, is going to be Marco Rubio. He's a senator. He's been on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee a long, long time. He's actually like probably the most normal guy that he's announced will be part of his cabinet. So, not that shocking, really. He could well be the voice of reason within the administration. Some of the sort of more alternative-minded folks who support Trump were kind of upset about it, specifically for that reason. They think that Trump is basically letting a fox, if you will, into the hen house. They think this guy's an insider and that he's going to undermine the administration or whatever. So we'll see. We'll see if he's an inhibiting factor or if he's just another loyalist. But on trade, he said Robert Lighthizer would come back. I think we talked a little bit about that last time. National Security Council head is going to be Waltz. Also relatively moderate, kind of not that shocking a choice. I read that Beijing is probably relatively relaxed about these choices because they could have been much more hawkish. Mike Pompeo, during the last Trump administration in the first term, talked openly about regime change and wanting to fight a Cold War with China and all that kind of stuff. So there's not really guys like that are going to be in the incoming administration, it seems. So it seems like the incoming administration should be relatively more mellow than in the last go around. Again, pure speculation. We shall see. It's going to come down to the man in charge, probably more than anything. But for the moment, it seems it's going in a relatively less hawkish direction than expected. emphasis on relatively. Let's see. Other choices, Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard. An interesting choice. I don't know what credentials she has there, but I'm sure she'll be very loyal, and that's probably the most important thing he's looking for. So I'm sure she'll be a very successful appointment in that regard. Probably the announcement that got the most attention was Attorney General. Did you hear about this?
No, I don't think so.
So the guy he wants to appoint as his Attorney General is Matt Gaetz. I don't know if you're familiar with the name, but if you've been following politics over the past couple years, he's definitely cropped up a couple times, generally for the wrong reasons. There's a big debate right now on whether or not the House should release an ethics report that was written up on him, because there's some ethical issues there. But at the same time, even if he's the guy that the Senate refuses to allow to go through, since they do kind of have to clear people that Trump wants to appoint to a lot of the higher positions in this government, he's just going to get replaced with somebody just like him. You know, Gaetz is definitely a Trump guy, a loyalist. He's got a lot of baggage, and that could well sink him. But ultimately, if not Gaetz, then it's going to be somebody like Gaetz. So, you know, it doesn't really matter if the Senate blocks him or not. But yeah, that is kind of the general direction of travel as far as the kind of people he's appointing to these important internal institutions. You know, the Attorney General is the head of the DOJ, the Department of Justice. And, you know, if you have more of a loyalist in there than he had, say, in his first term, where he famously had a lot of people that were very uncomfortable and reluctant to do some of the things he was asking them to do, he could get away with a lot more. And, you know, as expected, that's probably what will happen. Let's see. There was also this recess appointment strategy that Trump was talking about. He wants the Senate to go on an extended recess so that he can use special recess appointment powers that circumvent the Senate's normal review process. You know, normally they vet the candidates and then vote whether to allow them. But with recess appointment powers, the president can just circumvent all of that, and then he doesn't have to worry about it. So he's talked about doing that. The Senate may or may not play ball. One of the things that happened in the Senate over the past week is that there was a new election on who would be the Senate majority leader going forward. Because Mitch McConnell famously announced earlier this year that he was going to step down because he felt he was increasingly out of step with the Republican Party for pretty obvious reasons now. He's not a Trump guy, and the party is increasingly Trumpy. So they had a leadership election, and surprisingly, they did not go with like the lead Trump guys. You know, they didn't go with like a John Cornyn or a Ted Cruz or one of those sorts of people. They actually went with a guy named Thune. I think his name is Thune. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, chat. And he's a senator from one of the Dakotas, I think. I forget which one. But he was considered a relatively moderate choice. So the outcome kind of surprised some people, me especially. That wasn't what I was expecting. So that does show that perhaps the Senate will be relatively more independent than it looked like it was shaping up to be in the early days after the election, November the 5th. But we'll see if they actually, you know, exhibit that kind of behavior or not. You know, there's still a lot of time to go before the new administration comes in. So in that time, anything could happen. And of course, afterwards, anything could happen too. You know, it's all up in the air right now. But the fact that the Senate went in that direction does suggest that maybe the Senate will not just give in whenever the president or the incoming president, the president-elect, shall we say, asks for something like this, you know, the recess appointment thing. You know, it may be that the Senate actually says, no, we have a institutional authority here and we're not going to just give it up for no reason. You know, we have a role to play and we're going to do it. You know, Congress actually did a lot of that in his first term, both Republicans and Democrats, actually. It was maybe the first time in my lifetime that I'd seen the Congress actually grow a pair and, you know, do stuff that was at times at odds with the president. You know, the trend over the past couple of decades has been, you know, the so-called imperial presidency, where whichever party controls the presidency, generally that party in Congress is just very deferential to the president's leadership regarding legislative agenda, narrative, politics in general, that kind of thing. So it's kind of nice to see Congress actually doing its job for once. I think it's unfortunate that it took a Trump to do that, but at least it was finally happening. And then, of course, they went back to business as usual after Trump was gone. So go figure. But now it looks like they might take up the old hobby again. So that could be healthy for the political culture, or it could just be a flash in the pan, and we're just sort of in this long decline here. Time will tell. Yeah, the only other thing I had, there was the military thing. Yeah, so the incoming team, the president-elect basically announced that there's going to be a committee made that's going to review generals in the military, and if they are found to be too quote-unquote woke, then they're going to be weeded out.
What the fuck?
Yeah. So, I mean, make of that what you will. In general, the military is a fairly conservative institution. There have been generals that have shifted more in a DEI direction, but I have a hard time believing any of that was like particularly serious, knowing the military. But I'm sure there's some guys that they could pick out and identify and get rid of them and try to make it look like a wholesale reform of the military. I don't doubt that at least is going to be possible.
What would a woke general be doing that would cause problems?
Well, the stuff that's gotten the most controversy is generals that have been advocating for more inclusion, DEI initiatives, DEI training, stuff like that has kind of gotten a lot of attention in right-wing media circles. And they've kind of homed in on that as exemplifying a kind of decay in the U.S. military. In fact, I've seen people go so far as to argue that one of the reasons the U.S. military is having so many recruiting problems is because the military has been, quote unquote, going woke, and that it's putting off the kinds of conservative people that would normally join up. I don't find that argumentation particularly convincing, because I think the military is more just struggling with the same problems that employers all over the country have been struggling with since the pandemic, which is that there's a labor shortage. There's better opportunities. Like if you can get paid better working a retail outlet than you can in the military, then why not do the retail outlet? Certainly you get
way
benefits
lower risk
for
to
working.
Yourself.
Yeah, it's less risk, right? So the cost benefit just checks out there, and the military hasn't really responded to that very strongly. I don't doubt that there are some people who are put off by politics in the military, but if you're put off by politics in the military, you should probably just not join, because even before this era of American politics, politics was always an intrinsic part of the military and military life. I've talked with my grandparents, my grandfather being a veteran of the Vietnam War, and you better fucking believe there's a lot of politics involved. It's not necessarily the kinds of partisan left-right politics you may be thinking of when you think of politics. Rather, it's more just like interpersonal politics. Like if you want a promotion, you've got to kind of buddy up with your commanding officer. Especially if you yourself are an officer. Then kind of whining and dining with other officers and with your CO and trying to network with people. That's all part of the game. So, if you don't like politics, then don't join the military, especially as an officer, because like a good chunk of the job is basically just finagling and networking and trying to get your way to a promotion so that you can stay in the service. It's unfortunately a key part of the job. It's less noticeable if you're enlisted. Am I getting that right? I'm always mixing up enlisted and unenlisted. But if you're not an officer, basically, there's not as much of that. You're kind of in for your however many years you're contracted for, and then you can just kind of leave if you want. Maybe you can stick around as an NCO for a longer period of time, but I don't think NCOs have to deal with nearly as much politics as like the full-on officers. People with more experience with this, feel free to contribute in chat. My sources, as I said, are fairly old, so maybe there's been changes in the recent decades, but I'm dubious. I've read evidence to the contrary, but I'll take primary sources in chat over that if they're available. I'll throw out the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. I have more of a background in economics, foreign policy, what have you, public policy. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please let me know. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later, and we do enjoy the feedback. It's always fun to learn new things from people of different backgrounds, experiences, etc.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Twitch chatters and YouTube commenters alike.
Yeah, if the worst this new committee does is to just, pick out a few people and punish them, that's probably getting off pretty light. I think the bigger concern for me, as kind of an institutionalist, is that it's possible they might weed out people based off of loyalty, specifically to the president personally. And that could be a problem because that's going to reduce the professionalism and competency of the military as a whole. I think we've talked here before about, why militaries in authoritarian systems, especially in authoritarian Arab systems, really have struggled over the past half century. And a big part of it is that loyalty was prioritized above competency in terms of how officers were promoted. And the result was that armies were largely not a threat to the established political class, whether that political class was like generals themselves or whoever, whatever kind of elite strata was governing the authoritarian political system they had created. The military was not generally a threat to them because they did that, but at the same time, the downside was that they just could not win wars. Like, by and large, they were just badly run, incompetent, and they could not really do more than like the bare minimum in terms of providing national security. So, if there is a broad-based effort to try to weed out people who are more loyal to the Constitution than to the president, that could have dire knock-on effects that impact the U.S. military's ability to basically just do its job.
Yeah, I remember you saying that I think was also a factor in the decline of the Soviet Union under Stalin, was that he preferred someone who was going to agree with him and do what he said rather than someone who is going to disagree and say, no, boss, that's actually a really bad idea. Maybe we shouldn't do that. It's like, okay, you go out a window.
Well, going out a window during the purges in the 30s would have been a pretty kind way to go compared to what they did to most people. But yeah, the purges definitely had a very dire impact on the quality of the Red Army. Results in 1941, rather, kind of speak for themselves. But we'll see. I mean, we can talk about it, but I mean, the reality is that there's pretty much nothing we can do about it now. So whatever he's going to do is just going to happen, and it's just going to have to run its course now.
I haven't heard of this asking the Senate to take a break so he can do stuff you're not supposed to do. Who would he appoint in that time frame, do you think, that they would object to?
It's going to be Gates, for sure. Gates is really the only one I think that would generate significant pushback. Maybe Gabbard. But, given what a shithead Gates has been over the past 10 years, he especially, I think, is going to really face a lot of opposition. So I imagine that's more who he has in mind. Keep in mind, it's not just about passing controversial people. Circumventing the Senate process here is also just about speed. The confirmation process just takes a lot of time, and so it can drag out for months. Some positions in some presidencies haven't been filled for years on account of the slowness with which the Senate, and other congressional bodies have taken to try to confirm nominees. So if you can kind of just circumvent that, then you can just appoint people really quickly and fill out those positions, and then have a much more capable government with more capacity sooner than you would otherwise.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Also, to get the ball rolling, expediency. It's one of the benefits of not having checks and balances. You can get stuff done instantly.
Yeah, but of course there's trade-offs with that, which I'm sure we'll be learning about shortly. The only other thing I had here as far as the cabinet is Elon Musk. I think some people were excited to hear about him last time. Mm-hmm. My apologies to the drinking game advocates. I'm afraid you didn't really have to have much to drink last time on that count. Yeah, so there was some talk about Musk having a position in the cabinet. One was announced. He's going to be the head of the Department of Government Efficiency, Doge for short. And yes, that is a cryptocurrency joke. I'm sure Musk himself thought of it, given his sense of humor. Here's the thing, though. We don't really know a whole lot about this yet. So, a lot could change in the next couple months. But from what I was reading in the past week, this is not going to be a department that is like created. Because, if you want to create a new department, you have to get legislation. You can't just be the president and say, okay, I have a new department now and it's going to do things and there's nothing anybody can do about it. Major changes to the bureaucracy require congressional approval. So instead of doing that, he's going to create this Department of Government Efficiency as an institution outside of the government. And again, what I was reading is that its job will be to give advice that is not binding. That's not really much of a position in the grand scheme of things. Elon Musk and I guess Trump as well has come out and said, they want to make major cuts to the bureaucracy. They want to make it more efficient. Musk is talking about cutting $2 trillion from the budget, stuff like that. Some people have been hyperventilating about that, but I'm pretty sure he means 2 trillion over like 10 years and not 2 trillion this year. So, I wouldn't worry too much about that. $200 billion in cuts a year is not like overly outlandish. It's difficult, but it's reasonable. But at the same time, I think that the fact that the incoming Trump team is saying, hey, we totally want Musk on our team. We want to give him some responsibility to try to find areas where government can be more efficient and to find cuts. But we're not going to give him a position where he can actually do anything. It's going to be completely outside of the government, and nothing he recommends is going to be binding on anybody. Nobody actually has to do what he says. So that says to me that this is kind of a bullshit position that's meant to mollify him. Thanks for all the money, buddy, but we don't really want to play ball with you entirely. So we're just going to try to pacify you as best we can. So, I don't know if Musk is in on the joke or if he's going to learn the hard way how politics like this actually works. We'll see. I've seen people online joking with each other and betting about how long individual people appointed to the cabinet are actually going to last. I don't think people have been thinking that Musk is going to last very long at all. He's definitely not an insider, and I don't know how much pull he can really be said to have. I know some people last week were saying, he was in on the call with Zelensky. Trump had a phone call with Zelensky, for those of you who don't know, and Musk was actually a part of the call. So stuff like that has people thinking that maybe he's going to have more influence on the administration and that it's a representation of state capture because he's a corporate actor. Acting within the government without any kind of official capacity. But the fact that he doesn't and will not have an official capacity, given what we know now, suggests that his influence will probably be fairly limited. That would be my guess at this stage. It's not unusual for politicians to try to curry favor with wealthy people to try to get their money and their support and whatnot. But generally what happens is that they end up getting burned. Right? They'll go out of their way. They'll have these little luncheons. They'll speak to them directly, personally, build a personal relationship, all that kind of shit. And then once they have what they want, then they just kind of disappear for a while until they need something again. That's a normal part of the game. It's not a part of the game you hear about a lot because nobody really gives a shit if wealthy people get burned. They don't really make for sympathetic victims. The general assumption on the broader public is that politicians and the wealthy elite have an incestuous relationship, and that they're kind of all in on the same conspiracy. But the reality is that they're all separate actors with their own agendas, and they fuck each other over with alacrity. It happens all the time. So my assumption here right now is that Musk is going to be in that category. I don't doubt that he'll have some influence in the incoming administration, but I'm a little dubious, given Musk's lack of political acumen, that he's going to be like a big player. Well, let's see.
I think they both have the fascination with attention and being in the spotlight, with Musk buying Twitter and Trump really liking just being in the news, whether it's good or bad. So they have some overlap in that sense, I guess.
Well, corporate America in general has kind of leaned into Trump over the past year just because they kind of sensed that he could win, and that if he did win, he would have like a lot of discretionary authority. And so if that's the case, it makes a lot of sense as a business to try to be on as good a set of terms as possible with the incoming authority. So I imagine Musk has very similar calculus in that regard. Some of it is for attention, sure, but I suspect he's kind of hoping to curry favor with the government. You know, his companies have a lot of contracts with the government. He has a lot of investments in China that could be negatively affected if the Sino-American trading relationship deteriorates. So, you know, it makes sense for him to try to be politically involved, given how many political ties he has there between his business and broader public policy. Let's see. I guess there was some stuff that I had in my notes we didn't get to last time as far as the election, so I could kind of just finish up on some of that stuff. One, it was a pretty quiet election. There was some expectation there might be violence, and there were some reports that there had been ballots burned in a couple locations, but that ended up being basically isolated incidents. There was no broader violence, no broader disruption. Everything went pretty smoothly, and so that's definitely a net positive. So hopefully that continues. Other than that, the fact that the GOP managed to pick up a bunch of votes from minority groups that have not historically voted largely for Republicans, that's caused a great deal of angsting in many quarters, but you know, overall it probably is a good sign. It's not really great to have like individual ethnic groups voting for like one or the other party exclusively or near exclusively. You know, you kind of do want there to be more diversity there in terms of voting preferences. And so that does suggest that people are voting more on their interests in politics rather than, you know, on their ethnicity or what have you. So that's probably a net positive for the political health of the country as a whole going forward. We'll see about what some of the other implications of that could be over the long run, but in the short run, hopefully it's an encouraging sign. One of the things to kind of keep your eye on is the independence of certain political institutions within the government. I think we talked before a little bit about how some institutions in the government have historically been independent, but that the Trump team says that they want to curb the independence of some of these. And so that could bring into question their trustworthiness, their competence, their ability to carry out their missions, and just otherwise make them less efficient, less capable, et cetera, with potential knock-on effects to the broader economy and society. So some of the particular institutions to keep your eye on: the Department of Justice, the FTC, Federal Reserve, more broadly speaking, like the Civil Service. That's kind of more like Schedule F, and you know, some of you are more familiar with that than others. But yeah, those are sort of the main ones to keep your eye on. Also, the Department of Defense for reasons that we already just went over. But I don't think the DoD is as vulnerable, just because, again, it's already kind of mostly a conservative institution anyway. Oh, and we'll also probably see more conservative justices appointed to the Supreme Court, but I think everybody kind of knows that by now. It's just more of the same. You know, a deeply entrenched conservatism on the Supreme Court will probably be a feature for the next couple decades.
How many conservative justices are there currently?
I want to say it's 6-3 conservative. Mm-hmm. Off the top of my head, you know, check my work, people in chat, you know, people listening, but I think that's the case. So that still leaves room for, I think, 1 or 2 more is what they could feasibly pick up, from what I've heard. Not including potential replacements for the conservatives already on the court who might step down.
Chat saying that it's super pog that the court said that bribes are legal.
Oh, what case was that? That was the one with the bus tender in a town? I want to say in Illinois. It was kind of like indirect bribery, right? Because the government officials responsible for issuing the tender designed it in such a way that only like this one guy who had like very particular types of buses would actually be eligible. Mm-hmm. And then like a year later, the team that won the tender ended up giving that politician a bunch of money. And the Supreme Court said that was not a bribe. I think that was the case. But yeah, they did effectively, you know, rule that indirect bribery in that vein is effectively legal. If you want to convict somebody for bribery, you really have to nail down the quid pro quo, like, very solidly.
Like that person had to do this in order to get the money, kind of a thing.
Yeah, because the argument in that Supreme Court case was that they were not giving the money to the politician as a reward. They were just giving him the money because he was in dire financial straits and they wanted to help a friend out. Well, how do you prove they're wrong? That's the trouble. Therein lies the rub. So, it's not as though there's not any grounds for the way they ruled. It's just very dubious and obvious the kind of precedent that's been set there. It's going to be easier to bribe people going forward. Not that it wasn't especially easy before anyway, but, de facto legalizing it isn't going to help either. So just a final point about the election here. Oh, actually not. I had some more data to talk about. We'll get to that. But as far as stuff that I had in my notes from last time I didn't get to, I think there's increasingly apparent in broader American culture a kind of visceral dislike specifically for the upper middle class professionals in particular, the kind of people that used to be called yuppies back in the day. Yuppies have always kind of had a bad reputation in American culture, but yuppies have kind of converged with the kind of hipster woke left in the minds of many people, especially on the right. And they've increasingly become the subject of opprobrium amongst broader and broader segments of the body politic, with the results as we've seen, where the Democrats, the preferred party of the upper middle class professional, is becoming more and more that, the party of specifically that group and not really much of anything else. And, that's a strong group to have as a core constituency, but it's not enough by itself to win. And they really need to figure out how to broaden that coalition if they expect to be competitive in future. And it's not clear if they're ready for that yet. So yeah, as far as data, there's been more counting that's happened. Not all of the votes are technically in yet. So the updated vote count has Harris having about 7.5 million fewer votes than Biden in 2020. So that kind of narrows the gap from last week when it was at 15 million. So not as bad. However, Trump's count has also increased. And he went from having, as of last week, 5 million fewer votes than he had in the last election to now having, let me check the work here, 2.2 million more than he had in the last election. So Trump actually did gain ground here in 2024. But he was not able, it seems, to gain all of the votes that Harris lost from Biden. And given how close the election is, and the updated data reflects this, the margin in terms of the popular vote is still very narrow, even with the votes having been updated over the past week. I still think the way the votes tallied supports the idea that it was a pretty narrowly won election and that it wasn't like a big swing. I think this is basically the same kind of election that we've been having for 3, maybe 4 elections now in a row. Because I don't think Obama beat Romney by all that much. I think that was also a pretty narrow win for him. And pretty much every election win since then by a president has been very close. Trump 2016, Trump didn't even win the popular vote in 2016. And then in 2020, Biden just barely eked out a win, and now Trump is edging out Harris by a couple percentage points. So, this very much feels like the kingmakers in American politics are just whipsawing from party to party because they don't really feel that anybody's really addressing their core concerns. I think that's a relatively better reading of the election than some of the hyperventilating on the left or some of the triumphalism on the right. It's still, I think, I would argue, a fairly disgruntled body politic that hasn't really found it short footing yet in terms of what it really wants to see from its government.
Chat, quick note, hyperventilating and triumphalism, that's the title for this video. That's a great, wow. Thank you. That describes the internet right now.
True. True. I would have to agree with you there.
The world is ending. This is the best time ever. Wow. It's like, chill, y'all. It's about to be more of the same shit, pretty much.
Yeah, most likely.
Slightly different.
Let's see. Some of the other data I saw updated. A lot of the lower turnout for Democrats actually came from declines in turnout in solidly Democratic states. So in those cases, it didn't actually matter that turnout was lower. In those cases, the states like California and whatnot, they were pretty much always going to go, for Harris. Mm-hmm. The margins of victory were, smaller in those states. We talked about that last time. And, that lower turnout does kind of reflect a certain disenchantment and lack of enthusiasm for Harris, if not the broader Democratic Party in general. But that said, that does suggest that the election itself was closer than has been portrayed. For example, the fact that most of the decline in turnout was in solidly Democratic states also means that there was not much of a decline in the actual battleground states where the election was fought and lost on the part of the Democrats. Battleground states actually, from what I heard, had turnout that was comparable to 2020. So there wasn't much change there. And in so much as there was a different election result this time, amongst all the battleground states, it was because there was relatively more turnout for Republicans and relatively less for Democrats, especially in core Democrat voting areas. Like, for example, the city environs in Philadelphia, some of the suburbs, et cetera, these kinds of places. The enthusiasm was just not there for Harris, and that's ultimately what sunk her. Trump, meanwhile, was able to not only maintain his vote, but slightly increase it. And that's pretty much all they needed. That was enough. That didn't change margins all that much. I think it was still like 100,000 or 200,000 votes that separated Harris and Trump in places like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. But even relatively minor differences in turnout, like what we saw in battleground states, that was enough. That's really all it took. So, yes, the Democrats need to make big changes. Yes, their core strategy hasn't really been working, but at the same time, like, given how mercurial voters are behaving over the past 15 years, it's entirely possible the Democrats could change virtually nothing and end up winning the next presidential election. Just because of anti-incumbency on the back of whatever bullshit happens over the next 4 years. That's just how much whipsawing there's been amongst voters. So we'll see. Ideally, the major political parties interpret losses such that they make changes to try to better reflect the public's will. But we live in the 2020s, so who knows? It's all going to come down to polling, regardless. Mm-hmm. I think I said last time, the Democrat strategy for this election was to try to win over suburban, soccer moms and other people like that who are kind of centrist in outlook and who were more receptive to accusations that Trump was a threat to democracy, blah, 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 et cetera. And while they did lose the election, that strategy did actually generate increased margins of victory in certain suburbs. And even in suburbs that they lost, they didn't lose them by as much as they have before. So, they were able to generate more votes with that strategy, but ultimately they hemorrhaged voters that were working class or generally solid Democrat voters that just didn't turn out. That was where the problem was for them. So, not the worst strategy. Like, it did technically pan out how they wanted. It just wasn't enough. And that kind of is where the soul searching is going to begin for the Democratic Party, whether that means they make only marginal changes in future and just try to ride public opinion to re-election, or if they make big changes and try to completely reorient the party's brand. That's what they'll be exploring for the next, probably year or two at least, going into the midterms in 2026. These years sound increasingly futuristic to me. Yeah. Betrays my age.
Welcome to the future.
The future is stupid.
Future is silly, but so is the past.
Well, sure. But, nobody expects the past to be better, necessarily. Yeah. People are optimistic about the future. So when it kind of underperforms, it's a little more disappointing. Mm. Still waiting for my flying car.
Yeah. What's up, Jetsons? Get it together. You can fly in a car in a video game.
That's true. Or a spaceship. And get blown up by pirates unceremoniously.
I prefer to ceremoniously get blown up by pirates.
So much more classy.
Yeah, it feels like there's a purpose to it.
All right. That's all I had on the election, so those of you tired of hearing about it will be happy to know we can move on.
For the people holding out hope that Harris somehow wins in the last second, what's the chance of that?
None.
Okay.
You can put that to bed.
Sorry about your hope, Chad.
Extinguish all hope, Chad. It's over. Consign yourself to the deep.
They won't, yeah. Harris isn't going to contest it either, because her acceptance speech was almost like kind of a dig at Trump not accepting the defeat last time.
Mm-hmm.
So, a difference in stance. You think that she's not going to run again, they'll field someone else.
Correct. I don't think if they'd had an open primary after Biden left that she would have been like the inevitable winner.
Mm-hmm.
It probably would have been somebody else, would be my guess. I was kind of dubious she was like the right choice even at the time. I thought given the bounce in polls she had at different points, including right after, she replaced Biden, that kind of suggested she might have a chance, but it always felt like it would be an uphill battle for her, and that's pretty much what it turned out to be. And, the campaign just couldn't hack it. Like I said before, they weren't too far off, but I think just the weight of incumbency was just way too much for them. I think the Democrats probably would have lost regardless, but probably there are more competitive candidates they could have run at the very least. They could have picked somebody who could have run with a younger cohort of guys that could be the basis for future presidential runs. As is, that didn't happen. Let's see, what else did we have here? We talked about Germany already. Talked about Biden. Did we talk about Russia and Africa? Don't think we did.
No, not that I remember.
So the report I read is that Africa Corps, which used to be called Wagner Group, the group of Russian mercenaries formerly led by Mr. Prigozhin, they have apparently deployed 200 troops to Equatorial Guinea to protect the presidency and also to train guards, presumably presidential palace guards. So this kind of represents an expansion of Africa Corps' footprint in Africa, specifically West Africa. They kind of been popping up in more and more places. In this case, it's a pretty limited role. In Mali, they have a general advisory role with the Malian army. Here it's just some guards and some training. So that's not all that much compared to other deployments, but it does suggest that they're building relationships with another state in the region, which is probably going to unnerve Washington. And an unnerved Washington is probably the scariest thing that you can say to a developed country, to a developing country government. Because the history of things that Western governments have done in the developing world when they're unnerved is not very peaceful. It can be pretty gnarly. So I imagine that if this is a minor deployment, then nothing will happen. But if Washington is sufficiently concerned that Russian influence in the region is expanding substantively at the detriment of Western influence, they could take action. They may start trying to pick out people within Equatorial Guinea's army or within the royal family. Well, I guess they don't have a royal family, but they de facto have a royal family, the dictator's family. They could try to find dissidents in there who maybe are interested in gaining power and cut a deal with them. Mm. That's the kind of Cold War bullshit we could be returning to if China and Russia actually substantively do make efforts to expand their influence abroad and cultivate personal relationships with individual leaders. So long as it's relatively low key, I don't think Washington really cares that much, especially given that it's West Africa. Latin America and West Africa have definitely been off of Washington's radar for some time now, effectively since the end of the Cold War. But that could change. And so this latest deployment by Africa Corps is the latest evidence that it could be changing. We'll see. But definitely keep your eye on that space. I would point out that it wasn't all that long ago that I think it was Equatorial Guinea was singled out by supposedly the CIA, possibly a leaker, possibly a quote unquote leak. It's not uncommon for governments themselves to fake leak information to try to influence events or share information with the public. So regardless, there was some information that came out of the government in some way, somehow, that Equatorial Guinea might be considering agreeing with the People's Republic of China to cooperate on the construction of a naval base that would be accessible to the People's Liberation Army Navy, that is to say, the Navy of China. And of course, the prospect of a Chinese naval base on the eastern portion of the Atlantic Ocean is not something the U.S. Navy is going to be very happy about. So there was a lot of consternation in Washington about that, and there was a diplomatic offensive, and there was a bunch of talk and offers to give money and help with training the Equatorial Guinea Army, blah, blah, blah. The usual repertoire of diplomatic influence bullshit happened as a result of that. And it kind of went away, but it's also kind of been clear since then that, countries in the region, specifically sort of Central West Africa, are shopping. They're kind of open for business as far as doing deals with great powers. And Washington's definitely been the lazier of the great powers in that regard. They really haven't been paying much attention. China, meanwhile, has a whole variety of initiatives, lending programs, schemes. It has Chinese on the ground who go to these places to work. Almost every part of Africa has some Chinatown somewhere to varying degrees. Not always on great terms with the locals, but they're there cultivating relationships and developing a ground game that the Chinese government can leverage into influence economically or politically. Washington doesn't really have any of that shit. The State Department is still largely an informal institution. For those of you who don't know, diplomats who work for the US government are not professionals. There's some who have been educated in universities like Georgetown that specialize in training people in international relations and then graduating them almost directly into the State Department. But those guys are relatively rare, few and far between. And generally they populate more the lower ranks of the bureaucracy. The upper strata, especially political appointees, are largely amateurs and volunteers. That's the bulk of their personnel. Some of them can be very talented. The volunteers in particular generally have business backgrounds that have involved them traveling around the world to different countries, getting to know people, their cultures, their language, their business practices, their legal systems. So they can often have a lot of insight into the countries they end up being posted to. But at the same time, because they're not professionals, they sometimes make amateur mistakes. Sometimes they're not always in tune with the politics of the government they work for, which can create friction and problems. And in general, there's just a lot of laxity in the way that the US government runs its diplomatic operations, especially over the past 10 years, where sometimes embassies will go years at a time without an appointee to run them, resulting in the bureaucracy there basically just kind of floundering and not knowing what to do most of the time. So basically, long story short, it's a mess. Individual diplomats can do a very good job. The civil service in the State Department is pretty good quality, but it's not professionalized. It hasn't really been rationalized in a modern sense like a lot of other bureaucracies in the US government. And so results can definitely vary considerably on a case-by-case basis, and all the more so in the populist era, because one of the things that happened when Trump first won office back in 2016 is that there was a big exodus out of the State Department, especially the first couple months after he won, and then another one after he actually took office, and then kind of more slowly but consistently over the course of his administration. And that resulted in a lot of expertise being lost that hasn't really ever been replaced and probably won't be for a very long time. And it could be that we're heading for another incidence of that, given that he's coming back. So I don't know how much help the State Department is going to be going forward, but yeah, that'll be a problem. That's something the US government should have been addressing a long time ago, and it just never has. I'm not sure how this turned into a rant about the State Department. What was I even talking about?
I don't know, but the State Department is something I don't know much about, so I'm fine with it.
Well, hopefully that made some kind of coherent sense, whatever it was I was driving at.
We started with Africa Corps and Washington.
Yeah, Equatorial Guinea, getting close to Africa, Washington may be overreacting. We'll see. But yeah, keep your eye on that space. We'll see what happens with Equatorial Africa. It's not going to be the last time they pop up in the news. Lots of developing countries are increasingly ambitious about trying to play great powers off of each other to try to get as good a deal as possible. The Solomon Islands was a great example of that.
Chat's asking, didn't China build a bunch of developing nations' state buildings and then bug them?
There's only one example that I know about, and it wasn't a state building. It was the headquarters of the African Union, which has its headquarters in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. So there was a big stink about that. The Chinese government helped fund it through the Belt and Road program. They constructed it. It was constructed. It's a very nice building. Everybody was very pleased about it. And then it came out that, the Chinese government had bugged all of it. So people were a little upset about that. But at the same time, what are you going to do? If you're an African country and you find out that the AU headquarters was bugged, there's not really any more you can do about that than finding out that the NSA in the United States has been, surveilling everybody. It's just something that great powers do, and you just kind of have to swallow. So, you complain about it, sure. You try to remove the bugs, obviously, but beyond that, you're not going to let that sabotage the relationship, because you get a lot more from the relationship with the United States and China than you gain by breaking relations over something like that.
Yeah, what would you prefer? A nice new building with surveillance or no building at all?
Yeah, that's not far from the truth. That's pretty accurate. Even if China bugs all the buildings that they build, those are still buildings they would not have had otherwise. There's a lot of infrastructure, especially in relatively risky investment locales like Africa, that have seen big gains in infrastructure from Chinese investment that they would never have seen from Western investment, because Western investment is much too risk averse. They don't want to invest in risky locales because they don't think they're going to get their money back. But with the Belt and Road project, it doesn't really matter. Most of that money is subsidized by the government anyway, and in any case, even if they don't get their money back, it doesn't really matter, because that money is more meant to generate demand for Chinese companies in China anyway. So even if they don't get their money back, they're still successfully siphoning money into their businesses, into their economy. And that has positive knock-on effects that can be worth the trade-off of losing money that you lend to these governments that never end up paying it back.
Interesting.
Oh.
I know Fuzzy Cord has been taking some questions, so we do have a few of those. No rush.
Oh, wow. Okay. Let's see. Thoughts on prediction markets like Polymarket going forward? Will they become big? I don't really think so. Partly it depends on, gamblers, because there's more and more of a gambling market for gambling on elections and, other weird shit like that. It only ever seems to get more abstract. So, maybe Polymarket could be relevant for that, but beyond that, I don't know how useful it's going to be. I remember many, many moons ago, when I was a college student, there was actually a university that had a market where you could buy and sell shares based off of who you thought would win the presidential election. And from what I remember, it ended up having a perfect record. It was a very strong predictor of who would end up winning. I don't know how similar Polymarket is to that. I haven't read a whole lot about it. I don't, in terms of polling, I would trust traditional pollsters more than a market like that. For one, a market like that is only really useful if the people in it are not trying to game it. And the more people using it, the more likely it is that that's going to happen, especially people are, gambling on it or some shit. The university program that I'm talking about didn't have that many people investing in it, and most of those people were probably themselves college students or professors or, analysts of one kind or another.
As soon as you get the broader public into something like that, there's going to be a lot of white noise. That's going to be hard to decipher from substantive swings. So if I had to guess, if I had to give an answer here, I don't think it'll become big, just because I don't see a whole lot of upside to it. But at the same time, I'm not super familiar with it or with its user base. So maybe there's something there that I just don't recognize yet. Let's see. Some governments authorized Ukraine to use some new weaponry or old weaponry in a new way in the war against Russia. Will that change anything? Will Trump cancel that authorization when he is sworn in? Yeah, so part of that was Biden announcing that they could use ATACMS in Kursk. The British and French governments followed that up by announcing that they would allow similar easings of their restrictions on usage of their ranged fires, the Storm Shadow missile, and whatever. There was another French one, I think. I can't remember what it was called. But yeah, there was sort of a broad American, British, French announcement, basically, that they were going to ease restrictions in that vein. It's not going to change anything much. Ukraine has already been hitting targets in Kursk with their own ranged fires. I think modified Neptune missiles, drones, stuff like that. So, definitely ATACMS and the other European cruise missiles will be useful in that regard. But I don't know that they'll be a game changer per se. I think they would be much more impactful if they could benefit. I think they would be more impactful if the United States, France, and Britain just eased restrictions significantly or even entirely, so that the full gamut of targets vulnerable in Russia could be hit using those cruise missiles. The trouble there is that would represent a significant escalation, and it's not clear what kind of arrangement Moscow and the West have in that regard. I've heard repeatedly over the past 2 years that individual leaders, especially President Biden, have had phone calls with Putin or even met with him personally and have talked about what they would do in the case of given examples of escalation. So, it could be that there's some kind of Russian red line there that the public doesn't know about that is keeping Western governments from just completely removing all restrictions on the use of their weaponry. But a small-scale escalation, like just allowing them to be used in Kursk, probably is not too escalatory in that regard, although that remains to be seen. But I imagine that's the logic. But yeah, overall, just allowing them in Kursk is probably not going to be small enough to change the overall trajectory of the conflict, I would guess. It's helpful, but it's not going to be enough in and of itself. As for whether or not Trump cancels that authorization, like I said last time, nobody really knows what the fuck Trump is going to do once he gets into office. It's kind of a big wild card. So, maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. It kind of depends on what kind of pressure he wants to put on Ukraine to come to a deal, or if he wants to focus on pressuring Russia instead to get them to come to a deal, or if he doesn't actually give a shit and he doesn't end up doing anything and just kind of lets them fight it out while making them pretend to negotiate. There's any number of outcomes there. It all really comes down to whatever his strategy for peace in the region is going to be, if he even has one. So that's what we have to wait and find out about. Until then, everything is just speculation. I have no idea. Let's see. Political analysts describe the U.S. election as a result of the diverging outcomes between people who work with knowledge and people who work with things, assigning 40% of the population to the former category, 60% to the latter. Though all income levels are better off in absolute terms compared to, say, 50 years ago, people are able to evaluate their position only relative to others, and many feel they are falling behind. What would we have to give up to solve this problem? As an economist said, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. Yeah. So, this is entirely correct, but I don't think the issue here is that people feel they're falling behind when actually they're kind of not. They actually are falling behind. The real income gains by the lowest quintile of income earners in the United States has either fallen or stagnated over the past couple decades. There's been very few examples of real income growth there over time. Meanwhile, the other income quintiles have done very well, especially at the very top. And the disparity is even more crazy when you look at wealth instead of income. Wealth is even more concentrated into the upper tiers.
So, they're not wrong that they're struggling and, doing worse. I think it's a little overstated how much the gains made by other income brackets and wealth brackets have come at the expense of the bottom brackets. I don't think that's necessarily as true as people might think. But regardless of whether it's at their expense or not, it is a struggle to be a working class American. Like that's not a controversial statement to anybody at this point. So what do you do about that? Like this was one of the first things we talked about way back when we started this segment, and I noted at the time that a lot of working class people in the United States were struggling, and despite the fact that they were struggling, really did not necessarily want redistribution. And I guess we touched on this a little bit last time too, so I apologize if I'm being repetitive. But the idea is that you could have what Americans think of as socialist solutions, where you redistribute income some way, somehow, either in terms of direct payments or maybe in the form of programs or certain entitlements, or like however you want to do that. That's one way you could redistribute the gains from globalization, from free trade, from all of the changes that have been wrought by technology, all of the benefits that have been accrued to certain quarters of the economy. Those could be redistributed to a degree to sort of offset the pain of the people who have been disadvantaged by those changes. But broad swaths of the American body politic don't like redistribution. It's kind of something hard-coded into the political DNA here. And it's not even necessarily something that stems from self-interest. A lot of people who are very poor and could benefit substantially from those kinds of redistribution don't want it, partly for cultural reasons, historical reasons, path-dependent reasons, blah, blah, blah. Like it's a whole conversation unto itself.
I'm getting a Kukio quote, one of the things that he used to love to say. America has two types of people, millionaires and temporarily embarrassed soon-to-be millionaires, land of the free.
Yeah, that's a very old one. It goes back many decades. I can't remember who the original guy who said it was. Maybe somebody in chat knows. Probably some famous writer or whatever. But yeah, it's fairly accurate. But I don't think it's entirely fair either to say that everybody who votes like that just thinks they're going to be a millionaire someday. A lot of them don't. Like a lot of people in the United States, working class people, are perfectly content to just work their asses off and be rewarded only with a home, a family, a normal life, basically. Like they're not asking for a whole lot. Mm-hmm. That for them would be enough. They're pretty content with that. You can see that in a lot of parts of the United States. So long as they're working and they feel like they're getting their fair share, like a livable, wage to some degree, then they feel like they're doing okay. They don't need to become millionaires. They don't need to become billionaires. If they can just get by on their own, that to them is prestigious. That's what's kind of desirable on a social level in the United States. That's American culture. Our culture of individualism really prizes the ability to be self-sufficient. And so, while we do have redistributive policies to varying degrees in different areas of public life, in general, people are very skeptical about them. And even in the cases where we have programs similar to what are implemented in places like Europe, they tend to be weaker, more watered down, especially in conservative states. You don't even want to know what workers' comp is like in Texas. Trust me, it's a very sad story. So yes, we do have comparable programs, but they tend to be a lot weaker, and that just has to do with this deeply ingrained skepticism of involvement by the government in the people's lives. Like there is a sense that people should be as self-sufficient and responsible for their own lives as is feasible. So, if you do have a structural change in the economy, which is what we've had in the developed world, as well as the world writ large over the past couple decades, that disadvantages working class people, people with something less than a college education, people who are able and willing to work with their hands and make a lot of sacrifices to try to get by, if those people just can't do that because the jobs are not there, because the economy just can't generate them, because those kinds of jobs no longer have a kind of comparative advantage in the developed world, then there's this question of how to address that. Now, in Europe, the answer would be just more redistribution. They don't have the problem with it, but in the United States, we have a hang-up about that. So we can't do that. But there's still a demand to do something. So what is that something? So my idea back in 2017, 18, whenever it was, the first time I talked about that, is that what will end up happening is that the tension, the kind of cognitive dissonance between what is being demanded and what is being possible, what's possible, what the government can actually do about it, is going to grow worse with time. People are going to assume that if the government can't help them without doing the thing that it doesn't want them to do, then that must be the result of a conspiracy or some kind of partisan bullshit. It must be something other than the government just not being able to do that. It must be something other than the absence of a solution that meets all of their demands. And I thought the result would eventually be the return of patronage politics to the United States. The idea being that the government would go out of its way to offer maybe jobs of some kind from the government itself, or maybe jobs in the private sector that could only exist with things like protectionism or other indirect or direct subsidies. And that these jobs would be kind of designed and catered to the working class American. And that this would kind of allow working class Americans to check both boxes, right? They could finally have a way of getting by, paying their own way. They would have the jobs that they need to survive. And at the same time, they would be able to say that, these are their jobs. This is them being ruggedly individualistic, being self-sufficient, while tacitly ignoring that the jobs only exist because of government action. Basically it would be a kind of mirage, a magic trick, where the government provides the jobs, but then everybody has to pretend like these are just normal, regular jobs, regular private sector jobs of the kind that Americans have always worked. So this would allow people to kind of have, to achieve that prestige of being self-sufficient while still benefiting from what is actually a redistributive government program. And then, of course, whichever politician or party facilitated that would get their undying loyalty, because, of course, their entire livelihood would depend on the continuation of that program. I refer again to the what I was talking about earlier with regard to import substitution development strategy, where you ended up trying to create infant industries, but then by doing so ended up creating constituencies that were dead set opposed to any kind of reform or advancement in terms of public support for those industries, resulting in their eventual implosion. So, we could well be cruising towards something similar here, because that's about the only way that voters, specifically working class voters in the United States, are going to be able to have their cake and eat it too, right? You can't benefit from government, large S, redistribution, and be somebody just surviving on their own without help, right? Mm-hmm. So whichever politician can pretend to make that happen via patronage is probably going to win their support. And, that's kind of where we're going, right? The Trump administration in his first term and probably in his second term is going to try to go out of his way to be more protectionist, to deregulate the economy in certain areas, especially energy. And everybody is going to pretend that stuff is really going to be significantly, substantially helpful to the working class. Maybe if he takes it seriously, it will be. But his first term did not really suggest that. There were gains in terms of income for people living in rural America during the first Trump term. I think they were one of the few groups that actually saw it, like, notably, statistically significantly increase. But at the same time, that's not going to return manufacturing, for example. Like, these broader fantasies about a general resurgence in the working class American are probably going to come to naught. Like I said last time, to the consternation of some, that a lot of what the Trump administration is going to do is going to be performative. This is probably going to be one of those things. Like, I'm sure Trump himself would like to create an extended patronage network of jobs that are propped up by direct or indirect government action, but I don't think it's going to be feasible given the political calculus in Washington. And I don't even know if he had the support he needs to get all the stuff he would need passed to make it happen. I think even in that case, it wouldn't be enough, because there's just so many working Americans who need help that you would need to create just tens of millions of jobs like that. And I don't think even the United States has that kind of money. But even just trying, that's going to make Trump popular, or any other populist that kind of takes up the mantle of trying to do this. So I suspect that's going to be the long-term solution until either there's a structural change in the economy that allows for this group to resurge on their own, or until enough patronage jobs are created to kind of mollify people and to make the problem kind of subside naturally.
Quote was John Steinbeck originally, the temporarily embarrassed millionaires.
John Steinbeck, thank you.
Fuzzy cool, just knew it offhand. Crazy.
Let's see. I've seen a lot of commentary saying people trust podcasters that report news more than traditional media. Given traditional media got much of the predictions for the election wrong, how much will podcasts like the Young Turks and Timcast IRL factor into your future news consumption? Do you see a change in traditional news networks shifting to try and match the podcasters? Unrelated addendum, given you're in Texas, do you believe beans belong in Chile? Beans can belong in anything. Depends on the bean, depends on the recipe. But certainly beans can fit into chili. I've had some of the best recipes, chili recipes I've ever had beans in them.
Yeah, if you don't have room for beans in your chili, you could always get a larger pot. I know they're asking about preference.
But let's see. Do I think, I don't think traditional media is going to shift more to be like podcasters because they're just fundamentally different mediums. Traditional media, whether you like them or not, do try to adhere to a traditional code of conduct that serious journalistic outfits try to respect. And, we can critique them for succeeding or failing at honoring that code of conduct. Obviously, there's a lot of people that don't think they've been measuring up for the past couple decades. But there's always going to be demand for outlets that at least try. And podcasters do not try. Podcasts are more about self-expression than they are about serious journalism. And I'm sure there's some exceptions, but by and large, podcasts, the Young Turks, Timcast, IRB, like whatever your preferred outlet of choice, it's almost certainly mostly opinion rather than, rigorous fact-checking and that kind of thing. Again, there's just a difference between being an influencer and being a journalist. And podcasts cater to the latter. And there's a lot of demand for that because to a lot of people it feels more authentic because mainstream media companies have just been so undermined by the failure of their business model and also by just increasing partisanship in both their own coverage and amongst the public. More and more people just prefer to consume news that confirms their bias rather than just tries to be impartial. And that makes it hard to make money if you actually do want to make a substantive, earnest effort to be a real journalist. So, given the pressure is to be more biased, not less. But even so, even in the case of something like Fox News, like there's a difference between their commentary, their editorial stance and their actual news coverage. The news coverage on Fox is actually serious news coverage. When you get to like the pundits, the commentariat, the guys that come on at the primetime hour, like 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, what have you, those are the guys that have the most bias. And, unsurprisingly, those are the guys that tend to be more popular than, the actual news programs that actually make an earnest effort. And I would point out that even if there has been a shift in public consumption in the media towards groups like, the Young Turks, just podcasters in general and what have you, that's not new. That's not something that we should pretend is some kind of major evolution in the media landscape. There's always been a preference amongst the public for colorful commentary over substantive news analysis. Again, that's been a pattern throughout the history of American media. Like, none of this is new. The only thing new here is the form of media that it's happening on. The internet has allowed much greater access to, the, how should I call it, media, the means of media production, like however you want to refer to that. The barrier to entry into media is way lower. But that said, the kinds of media that have emerged from that they're just not that different from what we had before. Like if you look at something like Ben Shapiro or one of the other sort of right-wing media personalities or commentators or what have you that have their own media outlets or channels or what have you, and as well as like their equivalents on the left. 20 years ago, you could have seen the exact same shit on cable TV. Like there's really no difference between what's on YouTube now as far as political commentary, especially partisan political commentary, and partisan political pundits back when I was a college student. Like I see no real difference there. It's just the same thing, but repackaged now for a new audience on a new medium. And you can go even further back than that. Newspapers have always been, well, certain newspapers anyway, have always been fairly partisan. I've talked on here before about how, the Fairness Doctrine Act, or whatever it was called, the act that required equal time between political opinions and perspectives on major television outlets, that didn't really matter to the body politic and the political discourse in the United States. Some people say that getting rid of that is what poisoned the well and caused increasing partisanship in American media. I argue not so, because actually fewer people watched the news back in the day relative than read the news. The idea of watching the news is still a relatively modern phenomenon. It used to be that newspapers were like the main way you got news. And there could be extreme partisanship between newspapers depending on the outlet. If you go back to the 1930s and 40s and you look at the Chicago Tribune, not that distinguishable from anything you could see on the most partisan Fox News pundit program, even today. So nothing really has changed. It's just the same shit over and over again. I would not overstate that point too much. People love to talk about it. They say, traditional media is dying. I would say it's not dying any more than it's ever been. There's always going to be a core of demand in the public for that kind of media, just as much as there's going to be a core of demand for like hyper partisan content. Back during the Cold War, you had what was it called? Soldier of Fortune. It was very much a right-leaning magazine, and it had a very, very strong right-wing anti-communist editorial stance. And for a lot of people, that was the news. That's what they preferred because it fit their preferences, their ideological biases, as well as, equivalent left-wing publications. So, don't get too excited about the decline of traditional media here. If it's declining, it's not because there's just more partisan or more honest or whatever outlets. Really, I think the bigger problem for them is the money. It's actually gotten much harder to make money as a media outlet in general. And that's actually much more the reason why you see podcasts kind of taking off. Having a traditional media outlet that takes journalism seriously, that costs a lot of money. Being just some random dude who rants online, that doesn't cost anything except the public sanity. And that's pretty cheap in the grand scheme of things, unfortunately. So
it's also really hard to get people to read, quote, high effort journalism because it's usually delivered in a very dry manner. And that isn't really how people talk. Like normally when you have a conversation with a person, you don't have statistical rigor and sources cited and caveats about how you might actually not be correct about this. That's too boring. Most people just fall asleep. But if someone is shouting, they see the emotion and they also hear people kind of confirming their existing beliefs, like you said, confirmation bias. So it feels better to hear someone talk about a situation in your own language. If you're too formal and you're too correct, it feels too groomed and fake. Even if it is technically the best form of journalism that you could possibly deliver, you're trying your best, but it's going to be boring to people who aren't really looking for that quality of information. I would rather hear about how I'm correct than the actual news. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately so. So, I don't think traditional media will change that much. In so much as it does, it's going to be just in response to the decline in its business model. But I think podcasts are just going to continue along as they are. They'll probably get more viewers, but I don't know that they're going to be eating into traditional media's market in doing so. They are kind of distinct, different markets in the grand scheme of things.
Do you have a stance on InfoWars and Alex Jones?
Did you hear about that?
Not recently. What happened?
So he was sued by the Sandy Lake families. He went bankrupt. He's got a lot of creditors, so he had to sell InfoWars. So guess who bought InfoWars in the past week?
Elon Musk.
The Onion.
The Onion?
No shit. They actually bought it.
Wow.
Yeah, I was reading about it in the BBC, on BBC News, and they asked both Alex Jones and representatives of The Onion about it. So, of course, Alex Jones was upset about it, and he said, I'm not leaving until they make me leave, blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, they asked The Onion about it, and their rep said, quote, "We are going to make a very stupid website."
Wow. That's pretty funny.
Yeah, should be some good lulls to be had out of it. We'll see. The Onion is pretty reliable in that regard.
Yeah, I heard that they were kind of struggling to get material together because regular news was just so silly. They're like, I don't even know what to add.
Yeah, I'm still reminded / haunted by a headline I read way back in like 2020, I guess. I don't remember the exact year, but it was American public so shocked by decline in democracy that they decide it hasn't happened yet.
That's funny. Another question, are the threats Trump represents to our democratic institutions significant, and does the system of checks and balances we have pose a significant roadblock to these threats?
Well, that's the big question right now, right? It's hard to talk about Donald Trump in a way that doesn't seem partisan because, all of the criticisms that can be levied against Trump just sound indistinguishable from the normal partisan rhetoric that's been levied against every Republican candidate for 20, 30 years now. So, it's hard to talk about it in a way that people will take seriously and not just immediately lead them to reject you as a partisan hack. That said, yeah, there's a problem with a democracy electing somebody openly promising, whether he was serious or not about this, mind you, openly promising to abuse the powers of the Oval Office. That's not something that should happen in a mature democracy. So, if it has happened, as it has, then that suggests there's some kind of problem there in the political culture in terms of trust in public institutions. There's some kind of institutional rot happening in some part of the country, whether it's the voters, the politicians, the system itself, probably all three, if not other factors. But yeah, it's not a good sign. And, regardless of what Trump does, and this is an important point to keep in mind, even if Trump doesn't do anything that people are afraid that he might do as far as undermining government institutions, the fact will remain that the precedent has been set, that the public is willing to give the keys to the kingdom to a person who is willing to promise to break norms, ignore the law, and pursue his narrow self-interest. So that precedent is actually much more problematic than Trump himself, I would argue. It's entirely possible that Trump himself just acts like the clown he was in his first term and pretends to do stuff while managing to do pretty much fuck all. There's maybe like a handful of things that his administration can point to in his first term as a substantive accomplishment. And a lot of that stuff is just stuff any Republican president would have done. So if that's the case, you're getting off pretty light, but the precedent will remain, right? The precedent is still there. You've kind of opened the door to that style of politics. And mind you, even if you think Donald Trump is well-intentioned, even if you think he's just kind of a foul-mouthed but otherwise earnest politician who actually wants to help his country, the next guy might not be. And the precedent has been set that they can get into power by acting like that. And the barriers then have been weakened to try to preclude the emergence of a autocratic leader who will abuse those powers. And again, I'm not ruling out that Trump himself could become that autocratic leader. We'll see what he does in his first term. But regardless, the fact that the precedent has been set is like the much more worrying fact. Democracy is a very fragile thing. Just because it hasn't happened before, there's no reason it can't happen in the future. And keep in mind that even if it hasn't happened in the United States before, it's happened to plenty of other democracies. History is replete with examples of demagogues destroying their democracies. It's one of the big lessons from history. It's one of the reasons the college-educated crowd really fucking hates Trump. Obviously the fact that he's not a Democrat, that he's not left-leaning, that he's not super socially progressive, that's a problem, right? And, there's a lot of partisan hackery that goes into criticizing him on those counts. But, the actual substantive critique that, the example of history suggests demagogues like him are a problem, I don't really feel like that had a lot of currency in the recent election. I feel like a lot of the public wasn't really receptive to that, which is unfortunate because, of all the arguments criticizing Trump, like that's the one that has the most substance. That's the one that they should have really focused more on. Even if you didn't want to turn on him, you should have demanded that he behave himself. Like the norms of liberal democracy are in place for a reason, and it's not just for decorum's sake. It's not just superficial bullshit made to make everybody kind of behave nicely and set a good example for the children. Norms are in place to preclude and curtail the likelihood that a demagogue will rise to power and just totally undermine and destroy the integrity of the political system. That's the kind of thing that only people can do. It doesn't matter how well designed a political system is, how well designed the laws are. If the people responsible for running the machinery of government are ill-intentioned, then they're going to break it eventually. And if they have the public support in doing so, then it's impossible to save. That's it. You don't get to live in a democracy anymore at that point. Even if you think you're protecting democracy or whatever, in doing so, like, it's going to be taken away. You know, you cannot be so trusting of people as to just give them the power and assume that they should be taken seriously, but not literally, which is the phrase I keep hearing with regard to Donald Trump's more outlandish statements. Like, I can understand that perspective, especially given his first term being less extreme than a lot of his critics said it would be. But again, the overarching threat remains. Like, he is a demagogue, and demagoguery is being reinforced and rewarded here in this era of American political history. And that's a bad sign. That's generally been a predictor of decline in other democracies throughout history. So that's the substantive critique of Donald Trump and what he represents. And that's more what people should be worried about, I would argue. People are entitled to their opinions. I'm not going to tell you, what to think on it. I'm not your mother. You guys can kind of figure it out. But if you're looking for the best critique of Donald Trump, I think that's it. I think that's where it lay.
Yeah, I think one thing that, and then full disclosure, every news source has a bias, including us. I'm more left-leaning in a lot of my perspectives and that kind of thing, so feel free to disagree with me. But I think what you're also pointing to is kind of turning it on its head for the people who are very pro-Trump and him, like, changing a lot of stuff all at once. It sounds good to you, maybe if you're aligned with the perspectives that he's representing. But if there was a equivalent figure who is a leftist, that would probably be kind of gross and bad to you, right? If he or she would be firing a bunch of people and going against a lot of norms that you would consider to be checks and balances within the government, that would seem pretty bad. So yeah, I guess we'll see what happens and what actually changes, because he does a lot of talk as well. What will actually go through, that's another question. Border wall versus border fence.
Was there a second part to that question?
No, it's just one question.
Oh, okay.
Are the checks and balances enough to prevent something like that from happening, I guess, was the second part.
Right. I mean, yes and no is the kind of bland, dumb answer. Yes, they're enough to stop him from doing anything that is explicitly unconstitutional or that otherwise undermines rule of law in the United States. But those checks and balances only work if the people who wield them are willing to use them. And as we saw in the first term, there was a lot of reluctance on the part of a lot of politicians in Congress to do that. So in that sense, the answer is actually going to be no. And keep in mind that there's a lot more loyalists in Congress this go around than there was in his first term. So that's not an encouraging sign. So it just comes down to whether or not Congress is going to have enough spine to actually stand up to him if he does do something that is explicitly illegal, or maybe even something that's not explicitly illegal, but which is in clear violation of established norms of the office and of American politics. They may or may not be willing to do that. If they are, then there's going to be a lot less reason to worry about him. But otherwise, then we're going to experience firsthand what South Africans would call state capture. And I'm sure if we have any South Africans listening, they would be happy to extol on the virtues of state capture and all of the good it's done for them. Not much. It's been a rough decade for South Africa.
I think we do have a South African one. He said, "Ha ha, you guys are fucked. Ha ha." It's amazing, bro.
Certainly is amazing.
What is state capture for the uninformed?
So state capture is when the apparatus of government is effectively controlled, either directly or indirectly, by special interests. And I know immediately what people will say, well, that's always been the case. America has always been compromised, blah, blah, blah. It's an oligarchy. No, it's not that bad. State capture goes way beyond just mere lobbying. In the case of South Africa, what happened is that they actually had a South Asian business family. I want to say they were the Guptas. Maybe the South African guy knows off the top of his head. I don't quite remember the name. But they had a personal relationship with the prime minister, and it was very incestuous. Like, the prime minister directed a whole bunch of government funds and programs to this family, contracts, et cetera, whatever you can think of, they did it. And then the family, in turn, was able to benefit handsomely from that. And the whole government basically just rewarded and revolved. Sorry, the whole government pretty much revolved around that relationship and around benefiting the elites, be it the prime minister, the upper members of the ANC, or this particular business family. Again, I don't remember the name. And the result of that was huge amounts of money being siphoned away from things like infrastructure, hospitals, professional government services of one kind or another, pensions. Like, there was an immense amount of money that was taken away from stuff it was supposed to be used for and was instead distributed amongst the patronage network that was established by the prime minister. I think the prime minister's name was Jacob Zuma, if I'm remembering correctly. And so that endemic corruption laid the groundwork for a lot of the problems South Africa has now. Like, a lot of the rolling blackouts now in South Africa that are so common stem from the fact that a lot of the money that was supposed to be invested in maintaining and upgrading the electrical network instead was stolen by the government and redistributed to members of the patronage network. And obviously having, an inconsistent supply of electricity is not going to be helpful to any kind of modern manufacturing economy. And so South Africa's economy has taken a big hit correspondingly. And there's a number of other examples like that, in different areas of the economy. The electrical grid is probably just the most notable one. But that's the kind of thing that happens when your government just stops giving a shit. Like, they don't have to care. They can just be openly corrupt and take whatever they can get away with, which can be quite a bit if they have enough public support and enough support from institutional actors.
Sounds less than ideal.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly. But let's see, we have one last question. Thoughts on Pennsylvania approving $7 billion to start a Bitcoin strategic reserve? Gosh, thoughts? Incredulous thoughts? Surprised thoughts? Disparaging thoughts? Like, why do you need a Bitcoin strategic reserve? I'm not sure what they get out of that. It seems like if you want to have a reserve, then just hold something like gold or cash. Cash even is not that bad in the grand scheme of things. Like, I'm not sure what the purpose of the strategic reserve would be, and without knowing that, I can't really comment too much on it. It could be that they have a perfectly legitimate reason for it. But the fact that they want to have the strategic reserve in Bitcoin is very strange to me. I don't know what the purpose of that is. If they have a bunch of pension money, because states, are responsible for investing the money that goes towards pension payments and whatnot. If they're just diversifying their portfolio and putting a small percentage of that into Bitcoin, that makes sense. I could see that. Because every portfolio has risky parts of the portfolio and then safe parts. So it's not abnormal for, like, the risky part of a portfolio to have some kind of weird shit in it. And so cryptocurrency definitely fits the bill, to my mind. So, if that's the case, $7 billion is not that much. Generally, pension plans have assets that range in like $50 billion, $100 billion. So, $7 billion is not too much. I could understand that. But if it's just that the state is going out of its way to create some kind of special reserve out of nothing and just making it solely invest in Bitcoin, that is very bizarre to me. I don't know what the purpose of that is. I would have to read more about it.
Thoughts on crypto counter? Up to 1,482.
Yeah, we used to get them a lot back in the day.
Mm-hmm. back when it was hot and new. And people were burning graphics card money for it. Nowadays, it's a little bit more tame, but some people still ask about it.
Yeah, a lot of people lost a lot of money on it.
Yep. Some people continue to lose money on it even to this day.
And will probably continue losing money on it.
Mm-hmm.
People are very stubborn about it. Some people just really hate central banking, Neuro.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how are we doing on time?
We could basically switch over to a little bit of BG3 whenever you want, but I'll probably be wrapping in like 45 to 50 minutes.
Okay. Well, I didn't have too much else to get to. There was some protests in Abkhazia. We could probably just do that next time, though. Not that big a deal. Nothing's going to change on account of it. Just kind of interesting for those people maybe not familiar with Russia's near abroad and some of the statelets they've been propping up the past couple decades.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about the onion. Did we talk about the spy whale?
What? There's a spy whale?
Oh, yeah. That was in the weird section. Let me look that up. Yeah, I've been sitting on this for a while. Just haven't had time for it. So there was a dead beluga whale that was found near the coast of Norway. This would have been, I guess, a couple of months ago. And here's the thing. The whale had actually been encountered before. This was the same whale. It had been encountered 5 years previous. But the thing was, it was wearing a GoPro camera. And the camera had an inscription on it that said, "Equipment of St. Petersburg." And it also seemed, that is to say, the whale seemed very comfortable with people. And so that led some people to hypothesize that it was perhaps a whale that had been trained by the Russian government to go and spy on military installations. And that sounds outlandish, but the Russian government actually does have some history of training mammals to do that, specifically dolphins. During the Cold War, they did actually have a program to train dolphins to engage in acts of espionage, obviously involving, maritime espionage of one kind or another. So, very strange story, obviously, just for that reason. It seems the Russians are up to their old tricks again, using whales in this way. But then there was an update, which is that the beluga whale was later found shot to death.
Is that so it wasn't tortured and revealed its secrets?
I mean, I guess there was a group that had been formed specifically to keep track of it, some kind of NGO called One Whale. And they actually came out after this news alert and said they vowed, their words, they vowed to solve the murder as they saw it. And, the conclusion of the story is very anticlimactic. It turned out that the whale had not, in fact, been shot to death. So all of the consternation had been for nothing. But there's a significant amount of upset about it at first. And it led to a lot of good speculation and jokes about the nature of the assassination of the spy whale.
Interesting. Spy whales, weather balloons, what are they going to think up next?
I don't know if I want to know, man. I don't know about you guys, but I'm pretty tired of the 2020s roller coaster. I'm about ready to get off.
Well, we're almost at the 2030s.
I don't know, man. Maybe they're worse. I mean, 1920s and the 2020s, there's some parallels there. So if that continues, the 2030s are not going to be better. We shall see.
It's Great Depression, World War II. Yeah.
Oh, that's 24. Oh, yeah, the 2040s. Oh, boy. That's especially going to be exciting. If we're just doing a 20th century speed run here, then, yeah, 2040s are going to be the time to maybe check out. It's going to be bad for a while. That's about all I had, though. Unless there was something you wanted to get to.
No, that's very nice going over everything. Appreciated. I'm in a game, but kind of dead, but so is my opponent. Yeah, we can make a touch of bold escape progress, perhaps. If you're updated.
Was there an update?
Sometimes there are small updates here and there. I don't think there was a big patch or anything.
All right, I'll take a look at it. Let's see, what else did we have? Oh yeah, so as far as like weird news stories, I don't know that this is weird per se, I just kind of thought it was morbidly funny. So in East Timor, this was several months ago, they actually found out that they were going to host the Pope. He was going to come to visit. And the capital of East Timor is a city called Dili. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing it. But in preparation for the Pope's visit, the city actually started demolishing the homes of families near the city. These were people who lived in slums, who did not have the rights to the property they lived on, and they were completely dislocated and had their lives destroyed so that the path could be cleared for the Pope to come and visit. I thought it was a little bit ironic, I guess.
Yeah, it doesn't sound very Christ-like.
No, not especially.
Huh.
Still going?
Yeah. I'm pretty dead, though.
Let's see. Have you ever heard of the Princess of Norway?
Oh, I saw a meme about that. She looks like one of the, what's it called? The northernmost people who are kind of an indigenous population that's a mixture of Finnish and Norwegian. Sami?
Oh,
Is that what they're called?
I think that's Finland.
Oh, Finland?
I think in Norway it would be Laplanders. Maybe I'm completely wrong here. I'll defer to chat on that one.
Suomi.
There you go.
They're calling it. Huh.
Yeah, specifically, she's kind of eccentric. And what happened recently is that she married an American shaman. Sixth generation shaman, quote, servant of God and energy activator, who demystifies spirituality through his no-nonsense teachings, end quote. Yeah, he did an interview with Vanity Fair, and he claimed to have risen from the dead and said that he was a child a relative had predicted he would one day marry. Oh, no. When he was a child, a relative predicted he would one day marry the Princess of Norway. Which I'm pretty sure, strongly suspect at least, is a lie. I don't think that's true, strictly speaking. But the Princess of Norway apparently believes it, because they did get married. For the curious, no, this guy is not going to inherit the throne. She's kind of been pushed out of that inheritance at this point. They're not going to let the American shaman be king of Norway.
Even if he resurrected?
Yeah. Even if he resurrected. Yes, I'm afraid so. Superpowers notwithstanding, he may not inherit the throne.
Damn, well, at least he's not going to put up with any nonsense like death. Just get back up.
It's very driven, very motivated. Gotta respect that.
Yeah. He probably had undead aura where when you die, you raise again with 1 hit point. That's pretty funny. We've got some pretty good silly ones. Spy whale, that's cool. We'll look for more of that. Stay safe, chat. And remember, if you see a whale in the oceans, it could be a government agent. So use your best judgment. Thank you, Agent Smith, and thank you, Fuzzy Cord, for helping us out with the questions. And we will see you all in the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yep. Thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.